In the vast expanse of space, where 1,000 civilizations have risen and fallen, where gods walk among mortals and death itself has been given form, there exists one truth that echoes through every corner of the galaxy. Humans are different. Not because they're the strongest, the smartest, or the most advanced. They are different because when faced with the impossible, when confronted with forces that should obliterate them from existence, they do something that defies every law of nature, every rule of reality, every understanding of life, and death itself. They adapt. They survive. They consume. What happens when a species that has conquered death meets a species that refuses to die? What occurs when beings of pure energy encounter creatures of stubborn flesh that somehow bend the universe to their will through sheer, bloody-minded determination? The answer lies in a battlefield where reality itself became a weapon, where death walked among the living, and where one human's impossible act would change the course of galactic history forever. This is the story of Lieutenant Sarah Chun, the last human standing on a world where dying was supposed to be permanent, and how she taught the universe that humanity's greatest weapon isn't technology or tactics. It's their absolute refusal to accept that anything, even death itself, is truly final. The plasma bolt that should have vaporized Lieutenant Sarah Chen's head instead passed harmlessly through the space where she had been a microsecond before. Her combat suit's predictive algorithms had saved her life for the 47th time in the last hour. But even the best human technology was starting to fail against enemies that existed partially outside normal reality. Sarah rolled behind the twisted remains of what had once been a Terran Federation dropship, its hull now decorated with scorch marks that seemed to move and writhe when she wasn't looking directly at them. The planet Kepler 442b had been humanity's newest colony world just 3 days ago. Now it was a battlefield where the laws of physics came to die. "Command, this is Recon 7. Sarah spoke into her comm unit, knowing she wouldn't get a response. The ethereal beings they were fighting, the ones the scientists had labeled the Vorthack, had severed all communication with the fleet hours ago. Still alive down here, in case anyone's keeping track. The silence that answered her was expected, but no less crushing. She was the last of her unit, possibly the last human alive on the planet's surface. Captain Morrison had died when one of those floating, crystalline entities had touched him, and his body had simply stopped. Not death as humans understood it, but a complete cessation of existence. No corpse, no remains, just empty armor that fell to the ground with a hollow clang. Sarah checked her weapon's power cell, 63%. Her suit's environmental systems were holding steady, but the emergency rations would last maybe another day. None of that mattered much if she couldn't find a way off this rock, and the Vorthack seemed determined to prevent exactly that. She peered around the edge of her cover. The Vorthack moved across the battlefield like living auroras, their forms shifting between states of matter that human science had no names for. They were beautiful in a way that hurt to look at directly, geometric patterns of light and shadow that existed in too many dimensions for human eyes to process properly. Where they passed, reality seemed to bend and flex like heated metal. The strange thing was how they fought. The Vorthack didn't use weapons in any conventional sense. They simply approached their targets and touched them. That touch brought what they called the final rest, a state beyond death where the touched being ceased to exist on any level. Not just physical destruction, but a complete erasure from the fabric of reality itself. Sarah had seen it happen to her entire squad. Private Yates had been the first, reaching out to examine what looked like a harmless crystal formation. The moment his gloved hand made contact, he had vanished as completely as if he had never existed at all. Only the indentation his boots had left in the mud proved he had ever been there. The Federation's first contact protocols had failed spectacularly. The Vorthack weren't interested in communication, trade, or even conquest in any traditional sense. They seemed to view the human colonists as an infection, something that needed to be cleansed from their space. What they hadn't expected was how stubborn humans could be about dying. Sarah's motion sensors chimed softly. 3 Vorthack entities were approaching her position, their forms pulsing with colors that existed somewhere between blue and a concept her brain couldn't quite grasp. They moved with the patient inevitability of a tide, neither hurried nor cautious. Why should they be cautious? Nothing in their experience had ever survived the final rest. She hefted her plasma rifle, knowing it was essentially useless. The energy bolts passed right through the Vorthack without effect, as did bullets, explosions, and even the micronuke that Sergeant Williams had detonated in a final act of desperation. The entities existed primarily in what the scientists called conceptual space. They were ideas that had gained form, thoughts that had learned to think. But Sarah had noticed something the others hadn't. When the Vorthack touched something, there was always a brief moment, maybe a tenth of a second, where both the entity and its target became fully physical. It was the only time they could be harmed, and it was also the moment when their victims died. She had an idea. It was insane, completely contrary to every survival instinct humans had developed over millions of years of evolution, but it might work. The key was timing and a level of precision that would make a surgeon weep. The first Vorthack rounded the corner of the wrecked dropship, its form rippling like water made of starlight. Sarah could feel something in her mind responding to its presence, a growing sense of peace and acceptance that whispered of rest, of an end to struggle and pain. The final rest wasn't just physical death. It was a state of perfect, eternal peace that part of her genuinely wanted. She fought against that feeling, focusing instead on her heartbeat, on the weight of her weapon, on the taste of recycled air in her helmet. Human things, real things, things that anchored her to the physical universe. The Vorthack extended what might have been an arm, if arms were made of crystallized mathematics and ethical philosophy. It reached toward her with something that could almost be called compassion. This would be gentle, it seemed to promise. This would be beautiful. Sarah dropped her rifle and lunged forward. The moment of contact was like touching a live wire made of pure concept. Every nerve in her body screamed as her consciousness was suddenly expanded far beyond the boundaries of her skull. She could see/feel/know the Vorthack entity in its entirety, a being of perfect order and structure, a living embodiment of the mathematical principles that governed reality. But in that moment of mutual contact, the entity could also see her. It recoiled in what might have been shock. Where it had expected to find a simple biological organism, it instead encountered something that defied classification. Sarah's mind was chaos made conscious, a swirling storm of contradictions and impossibilities that somehow maintained coherence through sheer force of will. Humans, the Vorthack realized with something approaching horror, were not bound by the same rules that governed the rest of existence. They were paradox beings, creatures that could hold mutually exclusive concepts in their minds simultaneously, and somehow make both of them true. Sarah felt the entity's confusion and pressed her advantage. Instead of allowing herself to be consumed by the final rest, she reached out with her mind and began to consume the Vorthack's essence, not through any special ability or advanced technology, but through the simple human talent for adaptation and assimilation. She felt the entity's knowledge flowing into her consciousness. Eons of existence as a being of pure order, memories of worlds where chaos had been eliminated and perfect structure reigned eternal. It was beautiful in its way, but also sterile and lifeless. The Vorthack tried to withdraw, but it was too late. Sarah's mind had already begun to digest and incorporate its essence, breaking down its perfect structure and rebuilding it according to human principles. Principles that said nothing was truly impossible, that any rule could be bent or broken given sufficient motivation, and that survival was always preferable to perfection. The entity made a sound that existed somewhere between mathematics and music, a discordant note that spoke of disbelief and growing panic. It had never encountered a being capable of surviving direct contact, let alone one that could turn the final rest into a weapon of its own. Sarah felt herself changing as she absorbed more of the Vortex essence. Her consciousness expanded, her understanding of reality deepened, but at its core, she remained human. The alien knowledge and abilities were filtered through a human perspective, transformed from tools of perfect order into instruments of creative chaos. The other two Vortex entities had stopped their advance, their forms flickering with what could only be described as alarm. They communicated through direct conceptual transfer, sharing thoughts and experiences without the crude medium of language. What they shared now was unprecedented, the image of a human being consuming one of their own. Sarah stood slowly, feeling the absorbed entity's power flowing through her. She could perceive reality the way the Vortex did, as a vast, interconnected web of relationships and possibilities. But where they saw order to be maintained, she saw potential to be exploited. "You want to know what makes humans different?" she said, though she wasn't sure the entities could understand spoken language. "We don't just adapt to our environment. We make our environment adapt to us." She reached out with her newly enhanced senses and began to unravel the conceptual structures that allowed the Vortex to exist partially outside normal reality. It was like untying a knot made of living thought, each loosened strand causing the entities to become more solidly physical and therefore more vulnerable. The second Vortex tried to retreat, but Sarah was faster. She grabbed it with hands that now existed in conceptual space as well as physical reality and began the process of consumption again. This time, she was ready for the flow of alien knowledge and power. She directed it, shaped it, made it serve human purposes. The third entity turned and fled, its form breaking apart and reforming as it tried to escape through dimensions that Sarah could now perceive and follow. She let it go. Someone needed to carry the news back to the rest of the Vortex fleet. Sarah looked down at her hands, watching as patterns of light flickered beneath her skin. She could feel the presence of the absorbed entities within her consciousness, their knowledge and abilities now part of her own arsenal. They weren't destroyed. Humans rarely destroyed anything completely. Instead, they had been incorporated, transformed, made into something new. She picked up her plasma rifle and began walking toward the evacuation coordinates. The other Vortex entities scattered across the planet would be coming for her now, she knew. But she also knew they would be afraid for the first time in their existence. Fear was a very human emotion, and Sarah was about to teach them what it meant to feel it. Behind her, the twisted wreckage of the dropship began to glow with the same patterns of light that now moved beneath her skin. The absorbed Vortex essence was spreading, transforming the battlefield into something that was neither fully human nor fully alien, but somehow both. Sarah smiled grimly as she felt the approach of more entities. They were coming to investigate what had happened to their companions, drawn by a curiosity that was itself a very human trait beginning to infect their perfect order. Good. She was hungry, and she had learned that the taste of impossibility was surprisingly satisfying. The battle for Kepler 442b had just taken a very unexpected turn, and Lieutenant Sarah Chun was no longer just fighting for survival. She was fighting to redefine what survival meant in a universe where death itself could be consumed and transformed into something else entirely. The war between order and chaos was about to begin in earnest, and humanity had just gained its first weapon capable of fighting beings that existed beyond the normal rules of reality. That weapon wasn't technology or superior firepower. It was the fundamentally human ability to look at something impossible and ask not how can this be, but rather how can I use this? The evacuation site had become a graveyard of crystallized possibility. Sarah approached the coordinates where the emergency beacon should have been broadcasting, only to find the landscape transformed into something that hurt to look at directly. Geometric patterns sprawled across the ground like frozen lightning, each one marking a place where reality had been fundamentally altered by Vorthak presence. The shuttle that was supposed to extract her lay in pieces that defied conventional understanding of destruction. Parts of it existed in multiple states simultaneously, both intact and destroyed, both present and absent. The pilot's body was nowhere to be found, but his final transmission echoed endlessly in the crystalline formations, a loop of panic and confusion that would replay for eternity unless someone intervened. Sarah knelt beside the largest crystal formation and placed her palm against its surface. The absorbed Vorthak knowledge flowed through her consciousness, teaching her to read the patterns of order and chaos frozen in the alien structure. She could see what had happened here. A desperate last stand, humans trying to hold their ground while civilians evacuated to orbit. They had failed, but not completely. The civilians had escaped, carrying with them news of what was happening on the surface. That meant the Federation knew about the Vorthak threat. It also meant they knew she was still alive down here, still fighting. The question was whether they would risk sending another ship to retrieve her or whether they would simply glass the planet from orbit to prevent the threat from spreading. Sarah hoped they would choose the former, but she was preparing for the latter. Humans were pragmatic that way. A pulse of alien awareness touched her mind. More Vorthak entities approaching from multiple directions. Sarah stood and assessed her situation with senses that now extended far beyond normal human perception. She could feel them moving through conceptual space, their forms rippling with patterns that spoke of confusion and growing concern. They were afraid of her. Good. But they were also learning, adapting their tactics to account for her unexpected abilities. The Vorthak might embody perfect order, but they were not stupid. They had existed for millions of years by being thorough and methodical in their approach to problems. Sarah was a new type of problem. She reached out with her enhanced senses and began to examine the approaching entities more closely. There were 7 of them, moving in a formation that suggested coordination and planning. They were also maintaining their distance, staying at the edge of her perception range while they studied her. That was smart, but it was also very human behavior. The Vorthak were changing, incorporating aspects of her nature just as she had incorporated theirs. The difference was that they were doing it unconsciously, while Sarah was making the process deliberate and controlled. She smiled and began walking toward the closest entity, her boots crunching on ground that flickered between states of existence. The patterns of absorbed Vorthak energy beneath her skin pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat, creating a light show that was both beautiful and predatory. The entity she approached stopped its advance and began to retreat. Its form wavered uncertainly between dimensions, no longer the confident embodiment of cosmic order she had first encountered. Fear was a corrosive force, eating away at the mathematical certainties that defined Vorthak existence. "You know what I am now," Sarah called out, her voice carrying through both audible sound waves and direct conceptual transmission. "But do you know what you're becoming?" The entity's response came as a pulse of confused anxiety. It could feel the changes happening within its consciousness, the introduction of chaotic elements that should have been impossible for a being of pure order to contain. Yet it was containing them, somehow incorporating human uncertainty and paradox into its structured existence. Sarah reached into her enhanced perception and began to actively encourage those changes. She projected human concepts directly into the Vorthak's consciousness. Ambition, creativity, the desire for individual identity rather than collective unity. Each concept took root like a virus in the entity's ordered thinking, spreading and multiplying in ways that defied logical prediction. The entity convulsed, its form flickering rapidly between states as it struggled to maintain coherence. But instead of dissolving into chaos as Sarah had expected, it began to stabilize in a new configuration. The patterns that defined its existence rearranged themselves, incorporating the human elements while maintaining their essential structure. What emerged was something unprecedented, a hybrid being that embodied both order and chaos, structure and creativity, Vorthack discipline, and human innovation. Sarah stared in fascination as the transformed entity turned toward her, its form now pulsing with patterns that spoke of curiosity rather than the drive to impose final rest. It had become something new, something that had never existed in the galaxy before. Interesting, she murmured, and meant it. The hybrid entity approached slowly, its movements displaying a caution that was distinctly human in character. When it spoke, the concepts it transmitted carried emotional undertones that no Vorthack had ever possessed. Gratitude, wonder, fear, hope. What have you done to me? The transformed being asked, its communication now resembling language more than the pure conceptual transfer typical of its species. I helped you become more than you were, Sarah replied. The question is, what are you going to do with what you become? The hybrid considered this for a long moment, its form shifting as it processed ideas that would have been alien to its original nature. Around them, the other Vorthack entities had stopped their approach, their attention focused on their transformed companion. Sarah could feel their shock and confusion through her enhanced senses. The Vorthack had always been unified in purpose and thought, each individual nothing more than a facet of a single, perfect whole. The concept of genuine individuality was as foreign to them as perfect order was to humans. But now they were witnessing one of their own displaying independent thought, personal desires, and emotional responses. The implications were staggering. I can feel them, the hybrid entity said, its attention turning toward its former companions. They are afraid. They do not understand what I have become, because they cannot understand what they might become. Sarah nodded. Change is scary, especially when you've spent eternity believing that perfection already exists. But you're proof that there's always room for improvement. The hybrid's form pulsed with what could only be described as amusement. Improvement. Yes, I think that is the correct term. I am more than I was, even though I'm no longer pure. Purity is overrated, Sarah said, then paused as her enhanced senses detected new movement. More Vorthack entities were converging on their position, but these are different, larger, more complex, their forms radiating an authority that the others lacked. The architects, the hybrid entities said, its voice carrying newfound fear. They have come to assess the contamination. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the planet's atmosphere. Through her absorbed Vorthack knowledge, she understood what the architects represented. They were the governing consciousness of the Vorthack collective, beings of such perfect order that they existed more as living laws of physics than as individual entities. If the architects had decided that the contamination represented a threat to the universal order they maintained, they would not hesitate to eliminate not just Sarah and the hybrid, but the entire planet on which the infection had started. How many? Sarah asked. 3, the hybrid replied. That is concerning. 1 architect would be sufficient to end this world's existence. 3 suggests they view this as a threat to their entire paradigm. Sarah smiled grimly. Good. I was starting to worry this was going to be too easy. The hybrid entity stared at her with something approaching disbelief. You cannot seriously intend to confront the architects. They are to us what we are to your species. Beings of such fundamental power that direct confrontation is not merely futile, but incomprehensible. See, that's where you're wrong, Sarah said, checking her equipment and making sure her enhanced abilities were functioning properly. You're still thinking like them, assuming that superior power automatically equals victory. But humans didn't become the dominant species on Earth by being the strongest, fastest, or smartest. We became dominant by being stubborn, creative, and absolutely unwilling to accept that anything is impossible. She began walking toward the approaching architects, her form radiating confidence she didn't entirely feel. The absorbed Vorthack knowledge told her exactly how powerful these beings were, how completely they outclassed her, in every measurable category. It also told her that they had never encountered anything quite like human determination before. The first architect came into view as a pillar of pure geometric perfection, its form so precisely ordered that reality bent around it like light around a gravitational lens. When it moved, the very concept of movement was redefined to accommodate its passage. The second architect manifested as a living equation, its existence a proof of mathematical theorems so complex that merely perceiving them could drive lesser minds to madness. Sarah felt her enhanced consciousness strain to process its presence without losing coherence. The third architect was the most disturbing of all. It appeared as the absence of something, a void in the shape of absolute authority that defined itself by what it was not rather than what it was. Together, they represented the fundamental forces that the Vorthack used to maintain cosmic order: perfect structure, logical proof, and authoritative negation. They were the instruments by which chaos was eliminated from the universe. Sarah was about to teach them that chaos could not be eliminated. It could only be transformed. "We have observed the contamination," the first architect announced, its voice carrying the weight of universal law. "The corruption spreads beyond acceptable parameters. Cleansing protocols will be implemented." "Hold on," Sarah said, raising her hand in what she hoped was a universally recognizable gesture for wait. "Before you sterilize this entire planet, maybe we should talk about what's actually happening here." The third architect's void presence focused on her with the intensity of a collapsing star. "Human entity, you have introduced chaos into ordered systems. This cannot be permitted to continue." "Why not?" Sarah asked. "What exactly are you afraid will happen if order and chaos learn to coexist?" The question seemed to genuinely confuse the architects. Through her enhanced senses, Sarah could feel them processing the concept, running it through logical frameworks that had no provision for such a possibility. "Chaos cannot coexist with order," the second architect declared, its equation form flickering with mathematical certainties. "This is axiomatic, is it?" Sarah gestured toward the hybrid entity that had followed her. "Because that being seems to be managing it just fine. In fact, it seems to be thriving." The architect's attention turned toward their transformed former subordinate, and Sarah felt their shock reverberate through conceptual space. They had not expected to encounter a stable fusion of order and chaos. Their entire worldview was based on the assumption that such a thing was impossible. "Explain," the first architect demanded. The hybrid entity stepped forward, its form pulsing with patterns that spoke of nervous determination. "I am what I have always been, yet I am more. The human entity did not destroy my nature. She enhanced it, added new dimensions to my existence that I did not know were possible." "This is abomination," the third architect stated flatly. "This is evolution," Sarah countered. "And if you're honest with yourselves, you know it's been a long time coming. The universe isn't static, and neither are the forces that shape it. Order and chaos aren't enemies. They're dance partners, and it's time they learn some new steps." The second architect's equation form began to shift, processing new variables that had not existed in its calculations before. "The implications are extensive," it admitted reluctantly. Sarah nodded. "They are. But extensive doesn't mean catastrophic. Change is scary, yes, but it's also the only way anything ever improves." She could feel the architects weighing her words, their perfect minds struggling to process concepts that challenged everything they had believed for eons. The fact that they were even considering her argument, instead of simply eliminating her, was itself a victory. But Sarah knew that intellectual consideration was not enough. The architects needed to experience the benefits of chaos directly, needed to feel what the hybrid entity had felt when order and creativity learned to work together. She reached out with her enhanced abilities and, very carefully, very gently, began to introduce tiny elements of chaos into the architect's consciousness. Not enough to destabilize them, but enough to show them what they were missing. The effect was immediate and profound. For the first time in their existence, the architects experienced genuine surprise, wonder, curiosity about possibilities they had never imagined. The rigid perfection of their nature remained intact, but it now served as a foundation for exploration rather than a prison of predetermined certainty. The first architect began, then paused as it struggled to find words for an experience that had no precedent in its existence. Amazing, the second architect finished, its equation form now incorporating variables for concepts like beauty, inspiration, and hope. The third architect said nothing, but its void presence began to pulse with something that might have been excitement. Sarah smiled. Welcome to the universe as humans experience it, a place where anything is possible, where perfection is just another step on an infinite journey, and where the only constant is change itself. The battle for the planet was over, but the war between order and chaos had been transformed into something entirely different. It was no longer a conflict to be won or lost, but a collaboration to be explored. And Lieutenant Sarah Chun had just become the first human ambassador to beings that existed beyond the normal boundaries of space, time, and possibility itself. 6 months after the incident on Kepler 442b, the galaxy had become a very different place. Sarah stood on the observation deck of the Federation starship Prometheus, watching as impossible ships moved through space using principles that shouldn't have worked. The hybrid Vorthack human vessels were things of beauty and terror, their hulls flowing like liquid mathematics while their engines bent reality around them to achieve faster-than-light travel without actually moving. Beside her, Admiral Rodriguez shook his head in amazement for what had to be the 100th time since the new alliance had been formalized. "I still can't believe it worked," he said. "When we lost contact with your unit, I was certain we'd have to glass the planet from orbit." Sarah nodded, her enhanced senses picking up the emotional resonance from the hybrid crew members working throughout the ship. They were still learning to balance their Vorthack heritage of perfect order with their newly acquired human traits of creativity and ambition. The process was sometimes chaotic, but the results were extraordinary. "For a while there, I thought you might have to," she admitted. The architects weren't exactly receptive to diplomacy at first, and now they're requesting formal membership in the Federation, Admiral Rodriguez said, still sounding slightly stunned by the turn of events. "The Senate doesn't know what to make of beings that exist partially outside normal reality." Sarah smiled. "They'll figure it out. Humans are good at adapting to weird situations." Through the observation deck's transparent, aluminum windows, she could see the Vorthack mothership approaching for the scheduled joint operation. The massive vessel defied easy description. It appeared as a crystalline structure the size of a small moon, its faceted surface reflecting light that came from dimensions human eyes couldn't directly perceive. But now, instead of the cold perfection that had once characterized all Vorthack technology, the ship pulsed with warm patterns that spoke of life, growth, and purposeful change. The beings aboard had learned to embrace uncertainty as a tool for discovery rather than a flaw to be eliminated. "Admiral," came a voice from behind them. Sarah turned to see Captain Martinez approaching, his expression mixing excitement with barely controlled concern. "We're receiving a transmission from the Vorthack vessel. They're ready to begin the joint exploration of the Nexus sector." Sarah felt a familiar thrill of anticipation. The Nexus sector had been discovered 3 months ago, a region of space where the normal laws of physics appear to be optional. Initial probe data suggested the presence of phenomena that challenged the fundamental understanding of reality itself. Perfect territory for a joint human Vorthack expedition. "Thank you, Captain," Admiral Rodriguez replied. "Signal our readiness to proceed." As Martinez departed to relay the orders, Sarah's enhanced senses detected a familiar presence approaching through conceptual space. A moment later, the hybrid entity she had first encountered on Kepler 442b materialized on the observation deck, its form solidifying from patterns of probability and thought. The entity had chosen a name for itself during the months of integration. Synthesis. It was an appropriate choice for a being that embodied the fusion of order and chaos, structure and creativity. Sarah, Synthesis, said its communication now carrying emotional warmth that would have been impossible for an original Vorthack. Are you prepared for what we might discover in the Nexus region? As prepared as anyone can be for the completely unknown, Sarah replied. Which is to say, not at all, but ready to figure out as we go. Admiral Rodriguez studied the hybrid being with the fascination of someone still adjusting to a universe that had suddenly become far stranger and more wonderful than he had ever imagined. Synthesis, your people have been monitoring the Nexus for weeks now. Do you have any theories about what we're dealing with? Synthesis's form pulsed with patterns that Sarah had learned to recognize as deep contemplation. The architects believe we are approaching a region where the fundamental forces that shape reality are still unsettled. A place where the universe is still deciding what rules it wishes to follow. That sounds either incredibly dangerous or incredibly exciting, Sarah observed. From a human perspective, I understand that those are often the same thing, Synthesis replied, its communication tinged with what could only be described as amusement. The Joint Task Force began moving toward the Nexus sector, human ships and Vorthack vessels traveling in formation that would have been impossible before their alliance. The humans provided creativity, adaptability, and the ability to function effectively in chaotic situations. The Vorthack contributed their mastery of order, their understanding of cosmic principles, and their ability to exist partially outside normal space-time. Together, they represented something new in the galaxy, a partnership between chaos and order that enhanced both rather than destroying either. As they approached the edge of the Nexus region, Sarah felt her enhanced senses beginning to register phenomena that strained her ability to process them. Space itself seemed to be alive in this region, responding to observation in ways that suggested consciousness. Admiral, Captain Martinez's voice carried over the ship's communication system. We're detecting massive spatial distortions ahead. Whatever's in there, it's big enough to affect the fabric of reality across several light years. On the main display, the Nexus region appeared as a swirling mass of contradictions. Areas where time flowed backward, pockets where gravity pointed in directions that didn't exist, and regions where the electromagnetic spectrum included colors that had no names in any known language. My God, Admiral Rodriguez breathed. What could create something like this? Sarah felt Synthesis's attention focus sharply on the display, the hybrid being's enhanced perception probing the anomalous region. Not what, it said slowly. Who? The implications of that statement sent a chill through everyone present. Sarah reached out with her own enhanced senses, pushing her perception as far into the Nexus as she dared. What she found waiting there made her gasp in shock and recognition. Consciousness. Vast, ancient, and utterly alien, but unmistakably aware. Something was living in the heart of the Nexus region, something that existed on such a fundamental level that its mere presence warped the basic laws of physics. It's not a natural phenomenon, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. There's something in there, something that's been waiting. The entity's attention turned toward their approaching fleet, and Sarah felt a moment of contact that made her previous encounters with the Vorthack seem simple by comparison. For an instant, her consciousness touched something so vast and complex that it made galaxies seem small. Then, the contact was broken, but not before Sarah caught a single, overwhelming impression: curiosity. Whatever lived in the Nexus was interested in them. More specifically, it was interested in what they had become together. It wants to meet us, Sarah said, still reeling from the brief contact. The entity in there, it's been waiting for something like our alliance to develop. Admiral Rodriguez looked skeptical. How can you be certain? Because, Sarah replied, her enhanced senses still processing the alien contact. It's been alone for a very long time, and loneliness is a concept that transcends species. Whatever's in there has been waiting for someone who could understand the value of unity between opposing forces. Synthesis's form brightened with patterns of excitement and anticipation. A being that exists in the space between order and chaos. That would explain the reality distortions. It exists in a state of constant transformation. As they crossed the threshold into the Nexus region, Sarah felt the familiar sensation of reality becoming negotiable around them. But this time, instead of fighting the changes, both human and Vorthack crew members worked together to adapt to the shifting conditions. The hybrid technology that combined human innovation with Vorthack understanding of cosmic principles allowed their ships to function normally, even in regions where normal should not have applied. They were proof that opposing forces could not only coexist, but could enhance each other in ways that neither could achieve alone. At the heart of the Nexus, they found what they had been seeking, a being of such fundamental nature that it existed as a living embodiment of the principle that all contradictions could be resolved through synthesis rather than conflict. The entity communicated not through words or concepts, but through direct experience. Sarah and the rest of the expedition found themselves momentarily existing as the being did, simultaneously ordered and chaotic, both individual and collective, finite and infinite. In that moment of shared consciousness, they understood what the entity had been waiting eons to share, the knowledge that the universe itself was evolving, growing toward a state where all opposing forces would learn to dance together rather than fight. The alliance between humans and Vorthack was not an accident or an aberration. It was the first step in a cosmic evolution that would eventually encompass all conscious beings, teaching them that strength came not from the victory of one force over another, but from the synthesis of all forces into something greater than the sum of their parts. When the contact ended and they returned to their ships, Sarah found herself changed once again. Not just enhanced, but enlightened in ways that would take years to fully understand. "What happens now?" Admiral Rodriguez asked, his voice filled with wonder at what they had experienced. Sarah looked out at the Nexus region, where reality continued to dance between possibility and actuality, and smiled. "Now we learn. We grow. We teach others what we've discovered." She paused, feeling the vast presence in the Nexus observing them with what could only be described as approval. "And we prepare for the day when every species in the galaxy understands that their differences aren't obstacles to overcome, but tools to be combined." As the joint fleet began its journey back to Federation space, Sarah reflected on how far they had come from that desperate battle on Kepler 442b. She had started as a simple human soldier fighting for survival against impossible odds. She was ending as something new, a bridge between species, a living proof that evolution never stopped, and that the universe's greatest creations came not from conquest, but from cooperation. Behind them, the entity in the Nexus continued its eternal dance between order and chaos, no longer alone, no longer waiting. The first students had graduated from its cosmic classroom, and they carried with them the seeds of a transformation that would eventually reshape the entire galaxy. The battle that had stopped when they witnessed a human-consumed death had become the beginning of something unprecedented. A universe learning to live with its contradictions instead of being torn apart by them. Lieutenant Sarah Chun had saved more than her own life in that moment on Kepler 442b. She had saved the future itself and given it a chance to become something beautiful beyond imagining.